also not speaking. I'm also not speaking on behalf of my graduate program or in an absolutely authoritative capacity. I am an educator. I am a whole bunch of things, but I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form. So let's take that as our ground and we'll go on. So let's talk a little bit about microcredentials and what they are and where are they. We'll talk about emerging trends in the Calgary and Alberta marketplace, and this is more of a discussion conversation at the end about Canadian workplace needs and how microcredentials may or may not fit into that conversation. So first thing I need you to do is grab your cell phone. You're going to need it. And here is how this works. Share a different screen. Oh, there we go. I'm not working on my usual computer, so things are a little more chaotic than usual for me. All right, so you should see a QR code on your screen. If you pick up your phone and scan that, that's probably the easiest way to make the magic happen. Or if you're a keyboard and fingers kind of person, go to www.menti.com and enter the magic number 2906-2473. I can see a couple people have managed to get hooked in so far. So again, probably the best approach is to scan that QR code, or you can go to www.menti.com, and the magic number is 2906-2473. I've got 4 or 5 folks on so far. Let's see if we can get to 6 or 7. I think we've got about 9 folks on the call when I last looked. There's 6. Let's see if we can get to 7. And so folks, the nice part about this is it allows you to respond anonymously. You don't have to, be afraid of putting your hand up or being on camera or anything like that. This allows us to have a conversation anonymously in a little more friendly way. So let's start with a really simple question. How familiar are you with microcredentials? You'll see the scale goes from micro what now to totally my jam. And there's room in between. Lots of room in between. We can see that we're bouncing around about a 3.7, 4.2, 4.4. That seems to be about where we're at. Okay, so certainly a range of micro what now, and that's okay. That's honestly okay. Microcredentials are, at least in the way we conceive of them now, they're relatively new, but they're not really that new. I think the difference is that we now have ways of demonstrating your microcredentials a little bit more readily. And I think that's perhaps why they've appeared to become more prominent as we go along. So what do you want to know about microcredentials? Let's make sure I answer the burning questions. So this is a bit of a text display. You can type in your questions. I believe I've given you the option to enter multiple questions, and we will make sure that we answer these questions. I can absolutely promise you that I will answer the question, what is it? In fact, that's coming up in about the next 5 minutes. So that question will absolutely get answered. Fire away, fire away. I want to make sure that I, at least, if I don't know the answer, I want to be able to go out and find it. Options, tuition, and requirements. Yes, I think I can cover some of that. I don't know if I can cover all of that. Yes, so we can certainly get into building it into a master's or an MBA. Fast track certifications, definitely a thing. What is a credential? What are the trends? Aha! So I love this question here on the very end here. What are the ways to support that you have a credential, and when are they actually needed? Fantastic. I'll just give it another 10 or so seconds. I can't promise the options, tuition, and requirements person that I'll be able to answer that super well, but we can pull that back offline. All the others we should be able to touch on at one point or another. So I'm glad you folks are reading my mind. That's always a bonus. So let's ask another question. Which provider do you associate with micro-credentials, if you associate a provider with them at all? Because as we all know, micro-credentials just appear out of thin air and are attached to nothing. They're like, epiphytes. So they're hanging out on trees and just soaking up nutrients out of the air. That's exactly how micro-credentials work. We have institutions and professional bodies. Okay, so we've got some really broad categories. CSI, CSI. I'm presuming that's not crime scene investigations. We are going to have to explore this one together. Microsoft certainly is one. Yep. Any other specific providers that come to mind here, folks? Any kinds of specific institutions or any specific professional bodies that you might be thinking of? I saw, I believe there was an engineer who, or sorry, I guess that was an engineer featured on the Meet the Mentors page. So, perhaps a PEGA or the Saskatchewan or BC equivalents. So I guess what we're seeing here is that you're not even sure necessarily where the providers are coming from. Open source, Calgary educational institutions. And so that tells us something, doesn't it? It tells us that microcredentials fit into a space that's really not well defined. So hold on to that thought, because we're going to discover that we're going to bang our head against it consistently over the next little bit. And the last question I have, any content areas that you associate with micro-credentials? Like, I mean, you've mentioned Microsoft, you've mentioned CSI, you've mentioned professional bodies. You've mentioned educational institutions. So that, I mean, that's a pretty broad spectrum of providers. I guess it really, let's see what you folks think. And again, even if the answer is, you know what, I'm not 100% sure, put that in. That's great information. Data analysis, data management, software. Yeah, software is a really broad category. I mean, you can certainly look at that as Office, productivity software, programming, SQL, structured query language, which is a database way of communicating and retrieving information out of a database. So far, we have a bunch of nerds in the room, which is good. Business analysis, also nerdy. We have software development now as a separate topic from software. What else is going to pop up on the word cloud? Anything else going to pop up in the word cloud? Don't know yet. Okay, so it feels like the way that we understand micro-credentials right now is that they're technology centric and that they come from a whole range of providers, and we're not entirely sure how to evaluate perhaps the quality, how to evaluate any of those sorts of pieces. Great stuff. So now I'm going to bring myself back to the PowerPoint. I actually have to do that to remind myself to bounce back to the PowerPoint, because otherwise I just power right through. So to the person or people that wanted to know what a micro-credential is, The formal definition, the best definition that I've found actually comes from a really recent article, and I forgot to, I'm a bad academic, people. I forgot to give the full citation. I will go find the full citation for you and get John to email it out afterwards. A microcredential is basically a certification of assessed learning, and it's associated with specific and relevant skills or competencies.
Mhm.
And so you get the distinct impression that it's small, that it's assessed, which means that there's a way of measuring completion, of measuring quality, of measuring effectiveness. And the word specific and the word relevant also becomes really important. So the word specific just simply says, you know what, there's a really tight focus to it. As an example, one of my undergrad degrees was in general studies, literally. I have a Bachelor of General Studies from Athabasca University. That is about as non-specific as you can get. I took courses in political science and economics and computer science and all sorts of stuff. And it's not particularly specific. Was it particularly relevant? Yeah, I've used some of the tools. Microcredentials are almost the exact opposite of that. They are a very specific tool, they're a very specific skill, and industry or companies or sometimes government are saying that these are the things that we want to focus on. And folks, I'll also just encourage you, if you want to flag a question, like just put up your virtual hand, and I'm not seeing the usual screen that I would see. So John, I might have to get you to flag me if you see a question, please. So I did some research. That's what I do. I'm a researcher and an academic. Look at all of these different places that offer microcredentials. Bow Valley College, SAIT, University of Calgary, Mount Royal, Medicinet College, IBM, Shopify, University of Toronto, and the list goes on. The reality is that virtually every Canadian post-secondary institution right now is doing something in the microcredential space. That's kind of wild. We're not used to operating that fast. That's not our standard speed. We operate at academic speed, which is an awful lot slower. And Bow Valley College, they're 100% in the geek nerd space. They've got data governance and data management courses, cloud apps and cloud governance. Here at SAIT, I was absolutely befuddled. I did not know you could do a welding microcredential. This is my own institution, and I didn't know that. We also can do computer-aided drafting and design and construction microcredentials. I thought that was kind of interesting. University of Calgary has this breadth of microcredentials. One that was kind of neat to me as a grad student is a microcredential on quality graduate supervision, or on upstanders, which appears to be sort of a way to encourage people to take action when they see people being wronged, which I thought was kind of an interesting perspective. Mount Royal is doing things in environmental, social, and governance concerns, and they're looking at piloting a machine learning microcredential. Medicinet College down in the southeastern corner of the province is doing drone pilot training, or more formally, unmanned aerial vehicles. They're doing permaculture, and if I understand that correctly, it's about how we build an environmental piece that's resilient, and they've got tourism and hospitality ones. IBM, as you might expect, geeky. Shopify, also pretty geeky. University of Toronto went sort of very businessy. And then there's all these other providers. I've got lots of experience with LinkedIn Learning. I've got some experience with some of the other providers. And I'll tell you, as an educator whose business is in certificates, degrees, and diplomas, and all of those sorts of things, these are weird. I'm not entirely sure what to do with them. So those are all not all, those are just a sampling of the providers and a sampling of the microcredentials. So let's actually take a look at a few examples of how they're actually being used. So right here in Calgary, Calgary Economic Development sponsors something called Edge Up, and that basically is transforming displaced energy professionals into digital professionals. They do some fantastic work here at SAIT. Some of my colleagues teach in that program. We've got partnerships with Bow Valley, University of Calgary, and MRU, all of whom offer slightly different facets. Google is offering 4 certificates, one in project management, one in programming, one in IT support, and the 4th one is escaping me right now. But they have Fortune 500 firms lined up to consider those credentials as equivalent to a traditional undergraduate credential for the purposes of getting into the entry level. Let me reiterate that. These short 3 to 4 month certificates at about 10 hours a week are being considered equivalent to the traditional degree or diploma, at least at the entry level. That's incredible. And it maybe also tells us something about over education and over providing. We know that microcredentials are being used by nonprofits, again, to help transition and train people. There are for-profits, including one here in Calgary, Lighthouse Labs is one, where again, they bring people together and they transition them into new fields. So perhaps being a web developer. The person that was asking about master's degrees, this is still a bit weird. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has this concept called a micromasters. And the idea is you take a number of microcredentials and they count as course credit towards a master's degree. I can't recall the exact number of courses, but MIT has this. I believe Stanford also is in the process of building connections into their master's programs. In Canada, we're not quite as comfortable with that. And there's this really simple reason for it. And that is that very often microcredentials are being run out of our continuing education divisions. And our master's programs are run out of our academic divisions. And they have different government requirements in terms of what approvals are necessary to get them running, what faculty requirements are. And so we're not as comfortable with that. With that said, here's a hint. Virtually every post-secondary institution in the world has some form of prior learning recognition. And so one of the ways that you can demonstrate that you've learned something is through courses or microcredentials or work experience. So you can take and combine a stack of those things, and you might be able to get credit for a project management course or an introduction to programming course or an introduction to networking course. You might also be able to get more senior courses as well, but those are some of the ones that are relatively easy. Traditional post-secondary institutions, at least in Canada, from what I can see, we're dipping our toes in the water. We want to do it, but we've got several hundred years of inertia working against that. We're used to the idea that there is a 13-week semester. You do final exams at the end. There's all sorts of projects and heaviness to them. And very often we're teaching more the critical thinking skills and the breadth of skills rather than the depth of skills. So that it's not a great fit yet for who we are as post-secondary institution. I fully expect that that'll change, but as of today, it's not there. So why are we getting so hot on microcredentials? Well, for one, if you want to take a traditional diploma, you come hang out here and take a traditional 2-year diploma. The absolute quickest that you can get it done is 16 months. And that's if you take no breaks. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to spend 16 months going to school, having no income, having to juggle all this stuff, particularly if I've got a family or other responsibilities. it's really, really hard to figure out how you would take a diploma. Well, online only partially replicates that. And it's still a pretty big commitment. I did my master's part-time, but even part-time, it was painful. It was 3 years. I would never want, well, actually I am doing it again, part-time. And it's equally, it actually is more painful, but that's not the point. The point is that micro-credentials, because most of them are somewhere in the 3 to 15-hour range, more people can access that. Their tuition is a lot lower. I've seen price points ranging from free to a couple $100s. That's a lot more accessible to a broader spectrum of the population. And so why that improves diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes is folks that may not be in a position to go back to school full time or go back to school in a more formalized and structured way. Very often tend to be people of color, people with disabilities, new immigrants, all sorts of folks like that that we want to be able to extend our knowledge into. Micro-credentials give you a bit of a chance to top up your existing skills and knowledge. And I'll let you in on a dirty little secret. At the graduate level, it is super common to see like a 3 or a 5-day course in statistical analysis using tool X or applying methodology Y to your research project. Those were like the original micro-credentials. And we would take those and be all snooty because we've got our research credential and we've taken this short course and yay, look at us, we can do this. This is sort of democratizing the ability to top up our skills and knowledge. It can help us move into adjacent fields. So many bright people are quantitatively oriented and they just don't necessarily have the skills to run through an SPSS regression or to build out something in R or to do a Monte Carlo simulation and interpret the results. Well, guess what? If I give you a couple of micro-credentials, you can get yourself to a basic level of understanding and build from there. So you might have been an engineer, you might have been a geologist, you might have even been a mathematician. None of those makes you a statistician or wanting to run multiple regressions. Believe me, I don't want to run them either. So join the club. In theory, they're more nimble. In theory, they're more agile. There is a micro-credential framework nationally, but it's a hodgepodge of organizations that have put it together. And to this point, we don't have the same level of consistency as we do. There's Canadian standards on what makes a bachelor's degree. There's Canadian standards on what makes a master's degree, and global standards for that matter for most of these things. So micro-credentials are still a little bit of the Wild West. So
Blake, I'd like to interject on that point there for 1 second. I want to thank you for taking this on because I think we have a lot of people that have these type of questions. We're seeing this everywhere. You know, what do they qualify? How do they do so? Your terminology of using it as the Wild West is quite fair because there isn't all the regulation that we're used to in other areas. So number one, thank you for taking this on because it is sort of a wild territory. And for everybody with questions, this just sort of supports the idea that this is still a developing field, something that's new and still needs to get kind of all its proper controls put on. So good point. Thank you for bringing that up, just so we're all clear that this is new territory.
100%, John. And so let me just pull up another Menti screen. So now that you've discovered just what the Wild West looks like, I lost my share window again. There we go. Nope, wrong window, that window. All right, so now, folks, put on your thinking hats. Who do you think micro-credentials are best suited for? This is my best guess as to some of the groups that might be out there. And by the way, if you think I've missed one, again, just drop it in the chat. And one way or the other, John or I will pick it up. We'll figure it out. We're moderately intelligent people. So so far, we're thinking that career changers by choice, people re-entering the workforce. We're not as confident so far, or at least we don't have data. Sorry, I guess we don't have data. That's just one response so far. Let's see if we can get more responses. And by the way, folks, if you're just joining us and you haven't had a chance, there's a URL at the very top. Go to www.menti.com, MENTI, and then there's an 8-digit magic number that's going to connect you into this screen. And you'll be able to use it on your phone or use it on your desktop, and you'll be able to rank order these 5 choices. So far, we only have one response. Let's see if we can get a little bit more data. I'm a data guy. I want data. You folks are telling me that micro-credentials are all about data. So come on, give me the data.
And
There we
also,
go.
please, anybody that would like to include comments in the chat, feel free as well. So we do have a couple comments here. We have mature workers, also referred to as returners. And I think that makes sense, you know, trying to brush up, get the most sort of up-to-date credential there. And then newcomers are pretty equal to people re-entering the workforce in the sense of micro-credentials. All right, so we've got that's a good point to be made as well.
Absolutely. Oh, there's the chat. I'm sorry, folks. I just figured out where the chat went in my windows.
I gotcha.
There we go. Fantastic. So we can see here that micro-credentials may be applicable to a fairly wide range of folks, including, by the way, some of the very folks that we're mentoring to, that we have the privilege of sharing and learning from. Students in recent grads is another surprising one. And I've taught at both universities. I've taught at the undergrad and graduate levels, and I've taught in relatively applied programs and relatively theoretical programs. And there's definitely a skill gap sometimes when we're dealing with our students in recent grads. Some institutions are better targeted at that. Some institutions aren't so great at it. So definitely some senses there that they can be beneficial. That's great. So all things being equal, how much weight are you going to put on a micro-credential knowing what you know now? And if that's changed at all, that would be kind of a cool thing too. I've broken out 4 different fields here. Could I have a distinct impression that there's a bias in micro-credentials? And I want to see if you folks agree with me or not.
And I think also within this point here as well is if anybody has any comments on where are people coming from that are asking about the micro-credentials? Because I think, you know, this tells us what value do we put on it? And also I think within that is who's out there looking or asking about what these can do for them, right? So I think that becomes an issue as well. Number one, where do we think they're usable? And number two, who wants to use them? Who could benefit from it?
And really interesting, folks. One of the things I want to highlight with Mentimeter is it also shows you not only the weighted average, but it also shows you sort of where those responses are coming from, and definitely some differences between science and computing science versus some of the others. So there seems to be some weight, and you folks agree with me on the biases. Hang on a second here. We have a comment from Marcus, 100% Marcus. And I think that this is exactly what you're seeing from an economic perspective. We're seeing a crowding out of the certificate programs. And so we're trying to, I think what's happening is that micro-credentials are sort of replacing the individual courses within certificates for the most part. And so it makes it look a little quicker. But the part that I don't think we have yet, Marcus, is how do we take these micro-credentials and stack them into certificate? We still stuck at that. And as I said, it's because usually, well, in fact, in Alberta, a certificate is something that the government permits us to offer. versus a micro-credential, which we can more or less offer on our own. And so when we take things that have government requirements and things that we can sort of do on our own, meshing the two together can get a little dicey. Great feedback, Marcus. And I agree. I think that certificates used to be worth more. So now that I've completely managed to walk you through the Wild West, and I think we've managed to avoid the shootout at the OK Corral, if I want to extend that metaphor a little bit further. Any questions that I've created for you?
And again, does anybody have any kind of questions or scenarios that maybe have been brought up as they are working in their mentee partnerships right now? Are people asking for these? Are there certain areas where people are looking for information on them? You know, I think Blake makes a good point here. You know, this is something that, again, when you enter realms where there's accreditation required and things like that, there's a certain reliability and you know what is inherent within that. Now within the micro courses, you kind of have this sort of no man's land where, you know, you can prove your skills and show that you have those, but then what does the actual, you know, taking that course, how can that benefit you? How can that help? And I think that's a new area that's developing. So does anybody have any questions, anything that's been brought up to them along the micro credential line?
Well, one thing I'll share with you folks is I've had the opportunity to take a couple of micro-credentials. I took one just a couple months ago in intercultural communications, and it was here at SAID. It was an opportunity to take it as part of my employment. And, you know, it was decent. It was decent. I'm not going to say it was amazing. It was decent. It was about 10 to 12 hours long. The problem for me was that I teach the vast majority of the material that was covered in this micro-credential. Yet my employer said to me, Blake, go take this intercultural communications course. And I was like, wait a minute, I teach this stuff. I research this stuff. Go take the course. So, you know, certainly some variability there. And Marcus, absolutely. The quality and price is there. And we can also, again, go back to economics to answer this, right? Because when you spend money on something, you're like, I'm committed. I want in. And so the more money you spend, the more likely you are to at least try to gut it out and get through it.